When Iran was sending missiles to Israel, Israel was shooting at them, not in the airspace of Israel. Were they hitting down the planes with NATO weapons? Yes. Why in one case it's possible, in the other case it's not? What's the difference there?
That was Volodymyr Zelensky, the current acting president of Ukraine, speaking through an interpreter. His term officially ended this past Monday, but he's staying in office under a declaration of martial law. He was speaking with the New York Times this past Tuesday. In that interview, he criticized the West for what he called a fear of escalation with Russia and Western reluctance to greenlight Ukrainian strikes deep inside Russia with Western-made weapons. He also complained that the money being seized by Western countries from Russia is not being transferred to Kiev quickly enough. For more on that, we go to Moscow to speak with analyst Mark Sleboda. Mark, so this interview with the Times, Zelensky actually sounded kind of whiny. He's complaining that he's not allowed to strike targets inside Russia, although he's been doing that. He's complaining that the money that's been seized by Western governments that belong to Russia or Russians is not being turned over to him fast enough. And he's complaining in particular that Russia has not been isolated in the international community and that somehow this is the fault of his allies for not pushing this hard enough. Let's talk about this.
Okay, so Zelensky's claim that Russia is not isolated, of course, is a little ridiculous because Russia has never been isolated. The rest of the world refused the West's demands to stop trading with Russia, right? Which is why the Western sanctions have failed as badly as they have, because the world's economy has moved on. The West economically has more than anything just resulted in blowback and isolation economically of themselves, doing themselves, certainly the Europeans, maybe not the Americans, but doing the Europeans more economic damage. And the rest of the world rebelled. They refused to obey that order from the United States and from the West. But Zelensky was more specifically speaking that the West, in total, in particular Europe, but also the United States, actually continues to trade with Russia, and it's pretty extensive trade. For instance, one of the big current issues is the question of Russian liquefied natural gas. The European Union blocked, they prevented the transfer of pipeline gas to Europe, with the exception of a few that refused to play along: Hungary, Slovakia, Serbia, but not technically part of the EU, and a couple of others. But they actually, in the aftermath of that, they could, of course, not find enough energy at anywhere near an acceptable cost. And the result of that is they've actually drastically increased the amount of liquefied natural gas that they buy from Russia, which is not sanctioned and has not been sanctioned. Of course, liquefied natural gas is a lot more expensive than the pipeline gas that they were buying from Russia, which still makes their economies uncompetitive and is still leading to the deindustrialization of Germany. But it's still a temporary measure, and it still maintains the political fiction. The United States has been buying Russian uranium for its nuclear power plants through the last 2 years of the conflict. It is only now talking about restricting its use after they splurged in buying up as much of it as they could, probably potentially for that eventuality as well. So everyone in the West has still been trading with Russia on one form or another. And even in the question of say, oil, which Europe blocked from Russia, they're still actually buying Russian oil. India just buys Russian oil, mixes some of it with some oil from somewhere else, and then sells it back to Europe, which pays a markup from what they were charging Russia. So it's all political theater when it comes to these sanctions and the idea that Europe can survive without Russian economies. So that's what Zelensky is angry about when he says that the West has not isolated itself from Russia, which is what he is really complaining about there. And there's really no option for Europe to do that, because if anything, the last 2 years, it's proven that Europe needs the Russian commodities a lot more than Russia needs European tech and luxury products and tourism, because for the most part, because most of those tech products they can get from elsewhere, because actually, almost everything is actually built in China anyway, whether from European tech companies or U.S. tech companies anyway. So that has not actually been a problem for Russia at all. On top of this, him really upset about this isolation that that the West hasn't isolated itself from the rest. He's making the claim that the West doesn't want to beat Russia. Well, I mean, that's actually a moot question. I mean, you can make the argument that the West wants Russia, I don't know, to lose but not collapsed. And there's obviously, we've heard from the Estonian foreign minister suggest just that, and there are numerous other Western leaders and interest groups have talked about their plans their fantasy plans to divide up, to split up Russia, to decolonize Russia, as they've termed it. But it's like essentially neocon masturbation, right? It's nothing that has any chance in the real world of happening either now or anywhere in the foreseeable future. So they're, if they want to play around with those ideas, that's fine. But Europe, it looks more fragile, much more fragile than Russia at this point, including NATO itself. The other problem that Zelensky has right now is that the panic and desperation that he has is reaching levels that appear to be not only causing, of course, a lot of domestic problems and political problems in the Kiev regime in Ukraine, but also psychological problems for him. And the Western media has reported how The Economist reported how Zelensky has been screaming at his generals. And there are other reports also in the Western media that in the last few days, Zelensky just talking to a number of Western political representatives about the upcoming supposed peace conference based on the Zelensky quote unquote peace formula in Switzerland is essentially going to be a wash even before it happens.
Just for the benefit of listeners, this is a peace conference that unfortunately for the negotiating teams, Russia won't be invited to. So Russia has there's no one to negotiate with Russia because Russia won't be invited.
This wasn't actually ever intended to be a peace conference, right? That's just the branding. Zelensky's quote unquote peace formula is a demand for Russia's unconditional surrender, i.e. the side that is winning this conflict. It's a fantasy plan. It says
submit the leadership to the proceeding,
war crimes trials, pay reparations, all troops should withdraw from all of Ukraine, including Crimea and the Donbass, and leave all the people there to the tender mercies of Azov and Kraken and the others. Yeah, and Zelensky would like a pretty little pink pony with a ribbon on it too, right? I mean, it's complete fantasy. But the real intention was to bring the rest of the world, right, with a capital R, the global South, if you want to call it that, the rest of the world that has refused to stop trading with Russia together, and to browbeat them into with the threat of secondary sanctions on them to abide by Western sanctions and thus be in a position to dictate to Russia, okay, you've got to just surrender and blah, 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 which it's complete fantasy. This was conceived. This is actually the fourth of these conferences that have in a series. It's not the first one, and none of the previous three others have resulted in anything, and of course this one isn't either. They were conceived of before last summer, when Antony Blinken actually imagined that Russia would be defeated in the field now, that the NATO proxy offensive in the south would have succeeded, that Russia would be retreating and withdrawing from Ukraine, that this would lead to a political crisis in Russia and enabling regime change in Russia, and that the rest would be just dividing up Russia between the rest of the world. That was actually, according to Western mainstream media report, this is what he was thinking when they began this process. So Zelensky throwing a fit and yelling at Western diplomats about no one's interest in his quote-unquote peace conference, that is another sign of mental destabilization and the panic and desperation that he was facing. And it's clear, I mean, if it wasn't already clear from the previous conferences, but China and Brazil and South Africa have already made clear that they're not going to attend. India, of course, even if they do attend, it will be a played down, and they won't really have anything to do with what's going on there. And right there, that's the BRICS, right? That's the leaders, as it will, that the rest of the
South,
global South will take their cues from. And so if they don't, then the rest of the world is not going to suddenly start bowing to U.S. dictates either. So this whole peace conference is a complete, quote unquote, is a complete wash even before it happens. And somehow Zelensky seems to have, out of his desperation, fixated on this as if it was actually going to do anything. And now that it is collapsing even before it happens, that seems to be furthering his mental collapse at this point.
Yeah, his mental collapse is almost a heavy-handed metaphor for what's happening on the battlefield. Mark, thank you very much. We'll follow this up next week and see what happens between now and then.
Thanks for having me.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.